Hey everybody, hope you're doing well. Night in the Woods is one of my favorite games, period. If you're unfamiliar, it's the story of 20-year-old Mae Borowski, who drops out of college and returns to her hometown of Possum Springs. It's a story that explores a very complicated part of everyone's life. That period of time when you're still young and don't really know what you're doing, but you're rapidly approaching the time that you need to make a decision. The story delves into her mental health, how people grow and change throughout their lives, and it even delves into the supernatural with a mystery tying the whole thing together. I absolutely love this story. I love it so much. I fell in love with this game because a friend of mine who all he really played was Rainbow Six Siege and other shooters like that. He was a very one-track kind of gamer, very ADHD type, where literally he had ADHD. He had trouble focusing with longer movies and things like that. And so when he came to me and he said, "Hey Noah, I want you to play this 2D story-based game that is a drama with supernatural elements," I thought he was crazy. I was like, you sat down, you played through the whole thing. He said, "Yes, it's amazing." And I played through it and I absolutely agree. Any recommendations he gives me now, if it's a non-shooter thing, I know it has to be great because it managed to hold his attention so well. I actually love this story so much that for a college course, I actually adapted it into a show. I wrote a whole pilot for it and planned out the episodes and what arcs we were going to follow, adding things or moving things. And I highly recommend you go on to play this game. This video hardly includes any spoilers for the game itself, but I still recommend you play it so you can understand the full grasp of what we're going to be getting into. While there was never any plan for a direct sequel to Night in the Woods, there were plans for spin-offs and expansions. One expansion that actually came out during the development of the game was Lost Constellation. But none of these were meant to be direct sequels. But as far as I can tell, Infinite Fall, the group behind the game, never planned for a direct sequel. The closest that we ever really got to a full-blown sequel was Revenant Hill. Revenant Hill was developed by the Glory Society, a worker-owned cooperative built by one of the creators of Night in the Woods, Scott Benson, alongside Bethany Hockenberry. This game was announced in March of 2023 as a spiritual successor to Night in the Woods. And you can see why. The art style is fairly similar, and we're once again following a cat as our main character. This time around, though, the cat is not humanoid like Mae was. The story follows a cat named Twigs, set in the year 1919. After the barn he was staying in burned down, he's forced to stay in a log near a cemetery. But when the owl next door starts charging him rent, he has to figure out how to get by. And as the synopsis of the game puts it, it just gets more complicated from there. You can do various things like growing crops to sell at a secret market. This game features a lot of supernatural elements as well. There's ghosts, there's skeletons. You can try to figure out what the ghosts themselves want. That was meant to be an element of this game. More supernatural stuff would include things like making hexes and other things like that. It was really just a very unique style of game. It really reminds me of something like Over the Garden Wall in terms of the kinds of magic and darker atmosphere that you would be living in this game. Make enemies, make friends. There's a lot of different things that you could do in this game. However, we never got to see Revenant Hill come out. And the same goes for another Night in the Woods spin-off that never released. And I want to talk about why that is, but in order to get into these canceled projects, but in order to discuss what happened to these other games, we also have to get into the development of Night in the Woods and a very complicated developer named Alec Holowka. Now, before I get in, I'm just going to say off the bat, this is something that is a lot more serious than we've ever really talked about on this channel. I think the only thing that comes close in terms of real world events that have happened was discussing some of the things that occurred with the development of Life is Strange True Colors. But this goes a step further. We'll be getting into discussions about mental health, as well as certain accusations made against Alec, and it will get very serious. So if that is going to be an issue for you, I recommend you click off of this video now. But if you're still here and ready to go, let's dive into it. Scott Benson is really the core mind behind Night in the Woods. It really was his project through and through. Scott Benson was an animator and struggling game developer who would post animations on Twitter. Alec found these tweets and thought they were really funny, and the two began to talk. Despite how different both of them were, they really got along with each other. Some background on Alec. Alec had blown up overnight in the indie gaming scene because of the game he co-created, Aquaria. He also won multiple awards for this game. Neither of the two came from an extremely affluent background or anything like that. Alec was in the right place at the right time when that game took off, and it set him up really, really well. As the two got to know each other, Alec asked Scott a simple question: do you want to make a game? This is what ultimately started their partnership. From there, Scott discussed his ideas for Night in the Woods, and Alec suggested that they start a Kickstarter for the project. The Kickstarter was extremely successful and catapulted Scott from being a struggling animator to a real game developer. About 6 months into working on Night in the Woods, Bethany Hockenberry would join the team. This is what created the group Infinite Fall. They weren't an official studio by any means, it was merely a collaboration between multiple different people on this singular project. By February of 2014, Night in the Woods was being worked on full time. And to really illustrate how quickly things had changed for Scott, his game was being showed off at GDC and even E3. This was thanks to the publisher Finji, who they had developed a relationship with after the Kickstarter went so well. From the outside, things seemed to be going very well and moving very quickly, but internally, things were a lot more complicated than anyone could have guessed. Alec could come off as rude and crass. The first time Scott noticed this was at E3, how he would comment about other developers and other people within the industry. Scott, not really being familiar with all these people, didn't really know how to respond to that. And when he spoke to others about it, they simply brushed it off as Alec being Alec. Night in the Woods focuses a lot about the harsh reality of being a middle to lower class person, especially in a small, dying town. The game doesn't shy away from the fact that multiple characters are struggling financially and that in general the economy in this area is struggling. Possum Springs is heavily inspired by the Rust Belt towns as well as old mining towns within northeastern Pennsylvania and the northeastern part of the United States in general. I always associated Possum Springs with Pennsylvania and West Virginian kind of towns. Particularly towns like Oliphant carry a lot of the same features and the same history as Possum Springs. All that to say, the game focusing on financial issues and the harsh realities of life led to direct conflicts with Alec, who had a very limited understanding of this. He questioned why certain characters couldn't just leave their jobs or just go to college or things like that. Scott would say, "I'd have to explain why B, a character whose family situation prohibited her from attending college, didn't just leave and follow her dream. He didn't understand why, if anyone in town didn't like the town, why they didn't just move." This attitude led people to joke that Alec had been raised in a mansion with everything handed to him. But, as I mentioned earlier, he simply got rich and got acclaim at such a young age that it really changed his perception on how the world should work. A direct quote from Scott about Alec is, he'd talk about how he didn't care about money, didn't understand why people who didn't like their jobs just didn't leave them. He was baffled that more people weren't quitting their jobs and following their dreams. But according to Scott, he was open to learning and open to trying to understand these different perspectives. It was not uncommon for Alec's mood to swing up and down fairly wildly throughout the production. The first time that Scott really noticed this was when a roommate of Alec's texted him, concerned that Alec would hurt himself. When he confronted Alec about this, Alec claimed that it was simply a misunderstanding and an argument that went a little too far with his roommate. This was something that would occur throughout development. Alec would fly off the handle, become distant, and Scott would have to try to reel him back in. One of the first ways he did this was through the Lost Constellation game that I mentioned earlier. Alec was the kind of person who really threw himself into his work and didn't believe in a work-life balance, saying that work was his life. And Lost Constellation, which was made in a very short amount of time, was exactly what he needed to get back into things. However, things would not stay good. Scott would say, that fall, a little over a year into Night in the Woods development, Alec's behavior became more erratic. He more and more became convinced that a growing number of people were planning on how to ruin his life. I was still baffled by all this. Still, mostly just knowing the guy via our messages about work throughout the week. Something that needs to be stated is that Alec struggled with mental health issues. I'm not here to speculate on what exactly he dealt with or what exactly he was diagnosed or maybe wasn't diagnosed with. I am not a mental health professional in any way. But what I will say is that his issues were absolutely grounded in a deep insecurity, paranoia, and low self-esteem. Over the course of the next year, Alec would continue to spiral and sort of wane in how he contributed to Night in the Woods. Alec was very combative with Scott verbally over the game and over development, even at one point going so far as to say he was going to end his own life. By 2015, Alec had pretty much stopped working on Night in the Woods. The way Scott described it is that Alec was either completely distant from the project and not engaged, and that when he was very abusive to Scott and others. Scott describes himself as a fixer, a sort of people pleaser. He felt that there was something that he could have done to help Alec somehow get better and somehow not be the way he was. He tried to do this through enticing him to come back and work on the game. He went through and redesigned the game about 7 times, sending it to Alec, showing him new builds, creating individual pieces of music for him to try to entice him into coming back. However, none of these worked, and when the publisher found out about this, they directly stepped in to try to make Alec come back to the game. But not even this worked. But there was one thing that did. Bethany had become extremely fed up with Alec. Between his combative behavior with herself and Scott, or his non-existence in the project altogether, she was completely done. She decided one morning to create a private Twitter account to vent her frustrations to a close group of friends. She laid out about a dozen tweets of exactly how Alec was ruining the project and ruining her mental health. She laid out the way that Alec treated Scott and how Scott had to pick up all of Alec's slack with the project. Then, a little while later, Scott would wake up to a message from Alec with a screenshot of all of the tweets and the simple caption of, "Okay." It turns out that Bethany had not made the account private and that Alec had seen it. Interestingly enough, this seemed to be the kick in the rear that Alec needed to pull himself together, at least for a little bit. It was enough of a reality check for him to work on the project once again. In hindsight, they would call it a Christmas miracle because it happened in December of 2015. And Scott says outright that this event likely saved Night in the Woods altogether. While things did get better overall, this doesn't magically erase everything that Alec had done over the course of development. By the end of that year, Scott had already decided that he didn't want to work with Alec again. While Scott did confide in people about Alec's behavior, he always tried to keep it under wraps. He didn't want to spread rumor or ruin Alec's image. He just needed to get this off of his chest. It seemed that he hadn't fully grasped just how abusive this behavior really was. He felt really defeated about the whole thing. As I mentioned earlier, he saw himself as a fixer, and the fact that Alec was still having his ups and downs made him feel like he couldn't do anything about it. And as things normally go, Alec had his ups and downs. Alec was seeing counseling. He was becoming more social and had more real friends. In the eyes of Scott, Alex was doing as best as he ever had. But once again, this didn't exonerate him from everything he had done, and while Scott did not intend to continue working with Alec, he was still in. He hadn't been forced out, he wasn't explicitly fired, but because of the more casual structure of this organization, it's not like he was going to be coming back for another major project. But there's some information that kind of contradicts this and the idea that Scott had decided that at this point he would never work with Alec again, but we'll get back to that later. Then in February of 2017, Night in the Woods released, and it was a major success. The game brought in multiple awards and had incredible reviews. Now we're going to skip ahead to 2019. At this point, Alec was still working with Infinite Fall on another Night in the Woods expansion project, which comes back to the sort of conflicting nature of Scott's mention of no longer wanting to work with Alex by 2015. I'm just not sure if maybe I misunderstood when I read it, or if this was more of an internal decision by Scott to not get as invested with Alec as he once did. Maybe he was thinking he would still be cordial with him, but he wouldn't put as much personal investment into their relationship because of how he had treated him. Sort of playing into his fixer mentality, let's just keep the peace within the organization, let's keep things moving, but I'm not going to put myself in harm's way again. Then the allegations came out. A woman named Zoe Quinn accused Alec of an abusive relationship and sexual assault among other things. This took the indie scene by storm. It was a shocking revelation, and one that would deeply affect Night in the Woods, Infinite Fall, and Scott and Bethany. And that brings me to the first canceled project. Scott described this project as a thank you for the Kickstarter backers of Night in the Woods. Nothing more, nothing less. This likely means that it was a similar size to something like Lost Constellation. This wasn't a full-blown sequel, but more of a spin-off to Night in the Woods. As I said, this conflicts with the statement of Scott deciding that he no longer wanted to work with Alec all the way back in 2015. With the allegations that had been levied against Alec, those at Infinite Fall had decided to part ways with him. Because the studio wasn't a traditional studio, he wasn't officially fired, he was more so released. And this departure from Infinite Fall is what directly led to the cancellation of this expansion. 4 days after his departure from Infinite Fall, Alec would take his own life. Alec left a complicated legacy. It is okay to feel sad about someone's passing while still acknowledging who they were and the things that they did. Your opinion on Alec is yours and yours alone. I don't want to inject too much of my personal thoughts with this whole situation. The only thing I do want to say is I want to speak directly to those of us who might feel conflicted or might feel strange loving Night in the Woods and loving the music, knowing everything that we know now about its development and Alec in particular. My big thing is being able to separate the art from the artist is an important skill to have. I wholeheartedly believe that once you put something out into the world, no matter what level it is, no matter what kind of art it is, once it's out there, it is out of your control. You can try to comment on it, you can try to change things around, but when you put it out there, it's in the audience's hands to interpret and see how they want to see. What I'm saying is that Alec and Night in the Woods are two separate entities, and by supporting Night in the Woods and liking Night in the Woods, you are not endorsing his actions. Scott Benson himself actually said that he didn't really view Night in the Woods as Alec's thing, really, because of how much time he had spent away from the project. The music, sure, he played a heavy hand in that. But the game itself, the core of it and what it is not entirely Alec. It is also Scott's and Bethany's. All that to say, don't let this tarnish your view of a very incredible piece of artwork. Which then brings me to Revenant Hill. After all of this in 2019, Scott would eventually go on to create the Glory Society, along with Bethany. Shortly thereafter, they began work on Revenant Hill. The game was announced in November 2023, but not even 6 months later, the same year, the Glory Society would cease all operations. In a tweet from the Glory Society, they sort of say why. It's mostly due to health issues that are severely delaying development, and they're a smaller team. This is not a major studio like Electronic Arts or something like that has the manpower to just plug new people in when someone needs to take time off. The medical issues and the other things going on in the developers' lives deeply affected them and led to them making this very difficult decision to suspend operations, and by extension, cancel Revenant Hill. If you want my personal take on why the Glory Society ultimately fell apart, I think a lot of it does come back to Alec, which is why I spent so much time discussing the development of Night in the Woods. I think eventually stress, whether it's physical or mental, catches up with all of us. Scott put up with a lot. Everyone in Infinite Fall put up with a lot when it came to dealing with Alec and his abuse. That is not something that just vanishes. That is not something that goes away. It's something that weighs on you over time. And I think that at a certain point it becomes too much and you have to sort of step back from things. And in my personal and completely unfounded opinion, it's not like I know these people. This is conjecture. I think that that's what ultimately contributed to the Glory Society disbanding. So is there any hope for Revenant Hill or any of the Lost Night in the Woods expansions? Well, the Night in the Woods expansions, definitely not. I think that is something that is done forever. Now, Revenant Hill, it's possible that someone would come back. It's possible that Scott or Bethany or either of them could come back and try to restart things, but I do think it's very doubtful. I think he's given us so much already that I don't think it's fair to ask this of him. And I think things just are going to kind of rest where they are. Like, I don't think we're going to get Revenant Hill. I don't think we're going to get any of these expansions. And I don't think we need it. Scott Benson gave so much, and gave so much of himself to not only the gaming industry, but to Night in the Woods itself. And I think that's enough, because Night in the Woods is a beautiful piece of art, and that's all you can really ask for. So thank you guys so much for watching. I appreciate every single one of you. I hope you have a good morning, or evening, or, whatever.